Please don't leave. The little black girl cried to the biker as a locked door slammed behind them unexpectedly. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. It was a quiet night, the kind where the world felt like it had settled into a peaceful slumber. The streetlights outside flickered gently, casting their warm glow onto the damp pavement. Inside the small cafe, a handful of people lingered, the air filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and pastries. At the back corner, a group of bikers sat, their leather jackets reflecting the dim lights. The sound of engines humming softly outside seemed to blend seamlessly with the calm atmosphere inside. Among the group of men and women, one stood out, a large man, his face lined with the wisdom of age, his presence commanding. He was Jack, the leader of the Iron Riders, a man who had lived through countless battles, both on and off the road. His hands, calloused from years of work, rested on the table, but his mind was far away, lost in thought. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a gust of cold wind rushed in. The people inside barely noticed, except for the soft sound of footsteps getting louder. A young girl, no older than 8 or 9, stumbled into the cafe. She was barefoot, her small feet covered in dirt and blood, her torn dress fluttering as she rushed toward the bikers. Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Please don't leave," she cried, her voice cracking with fear as she looked around the room, pleading for help. Her body was trembling, and her hands clutched at the closest biker's jacket, desperate for someone to hear her. Jack stood up immediately, his instincts kicking in. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that made grown men quiver. He didn't need to ask any questions. He could tell something was horribly wrong. The little girls. Words echoed in his mind. "They're coming, they're going to take me." The rest of the bikers stood up too, a sense of urgency filling the room. Jack turned to the girl, kneeling down to her level, his voice calm but firm. "What happened, kid?" The girl's words came out in a jumble, each one more frantic than the last. "My brother, Jamal, they took him. They. She choked on her words, trying to make sense of the terror she had just experienced. Jack motioned to his crew, signaling for them to gather. "Stay here, and don't let anyone else in," he instructed, his voice low but filled with authority. He turned back to the girl. "Where did they take him?" The girl pointed to the end of the street, where the faint lights of a silver SUV disappeared into the distance. Jack could see the fear growing in her eyes as she glanced back at the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. The other bikers gathered their gear, their faces hardening with determination. "We're going after him," Jack said firmly, looking at his crew. "We're not leaving until we get him back." With that, the group of bikers mounted their bikes and roared out of the cafe, their engines roaring to life as they sped off into the night. The sound of their motorcycles echoed through the streets, a symbol of the promise they had made to this scared little girl. They would not let her down. As they sped down the road, the girl's eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. But for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to believe that someone would protect her and her brother. The night ahead would be long, and the journey dangerous, but Jack and his crew were determined to fulfill the promise they had made to a dying friend years ago. They would keep his family safe, no matter the cost. The roar of the engines echoed down the empty street as Jack and his crew raced through the night. The headlights of their bikes sliced through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. The wind whipped past them, cold and relentless, but none of the bikers slowed down. Not even for a second. Jack's mind was laser-focused on the girl's words, on the desperate cry in her voice. "They took him." She had said it over and over, pointing to the silver SUV speeding away. "They took my brother." Jack had made a promise to the girl's father, a promise that he was going to keep no matter what. The memory of his friend Tyrone's last words echoed in his mind, a promise that was more than just words. It was a vow that ran deep, forged in the heat of battle and sealed with blood. Jack couldn't let his friend's daughter down. Not now. Not ever. The convoy of bikers pushed forward, their engines rumbling like thunder. Jack was at the front, a man on a mission. His team was solid, a group of brothers who knew what loyalty meant. They had been through thick and thin together. But this time, it wasn't just about the ride. It wasn't about the thrill of the open road. This time, it was personal. They had a kid to save. As they neared the intersection, Jack looked at his phone, checking the coordinates again. They were getting closer. The girl had told them the general direction, but now they were chasing a ghost. The silver SUV had vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. The bike squad split into two teams. Bear, a mountain of a man, took the lead on one side, his bike roaring as he weaved through traffic with ease. He was a tank on wheels, a man who could knock down walls if he had to. His team was focused, following the trail without hesitation. Jack and the rest of the crew stayed on their course, weaving through the winding roads, the headlights casting shadows on the asphalt. The pursuit was on. "We've got to catch up with them," Jack muttered, his jaw clenched. "We can't let them get away. Not after what they've done." "I know," said Diesel, one of his most trusted men. Diesel had been with Jack through some of the toughest times. He was a former Marine, a quiet man with a fierce loyalty to his crew. He had seen things, been to places Jack couldn't even imagine, but he was always the first to show up when it mattered. "They won't get away," Diesel added. The sound of their bikes was like a war drum, signaling their presence as they pushed forward, their hearts pounding in sync with the revving of their engines. The world outside seemed to blur as they raced through the night, but inside, it was clear. They were on a mission, and nothing was going to stop them. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out quickly, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from Wrench, another member of the crew. "I'm on their tail. Just saw the SUV take a left at the next exit." Jack nodded, his mind calculating their next move. "Got it," he said into the phone, his voice low and steady. "Everyone, keep your eyes peeled. We're going in." As they approached the next exit, Jack's heart began to race. They were close. The girl's brother was out there somewhere, and Jack wasn't about to let him slip through their fingers. They took the corner sharply, following the path that Wrench had mapped out. The road ahead was dark, the only light coming from their headlights. The silver SUV was still in sight, but it was speeding away, its tires screeching as it tried to lose them in the maze of backstreets. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars. "We've got them now," he said, his voice a low growl. He could feel the tension building, the stakes higher than they had ever been. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was about honor, about keeping a promise, about protecting what mattered most. The bikers pushed harder, their machines roaring like wild animals. The silver SUV took another sharp turn, trying to shake them off. But Jack and his crew weren't backing down. They knew these streets like the back of their hands. They had seen things in the past, faced danger countless times, but this was different. This was personal. Jack's phone buzzed again. Wrench had sent another update. "They're turning into an industrial district. We're almost there." Jack's pulse quickened. "All units, prepare for the final push. We're going in." The convoy moved faster now, their bikes eating up the distance between them and the SUV. They could see it clearly now, the silver SUV barely staying ahead, swerving between the industrial buildings. Jack could feel the anger rising in him. The people in that vehicle had taken a kid. They had crossed a line that Jack and his crew weren't going to let slide. "Get ready," Jack muttered, his voice thick with determination. As they entered the industrial district, the air grew thick with tension. The narrow roads twisted between old warehouses and broken buildings. The silver SUV was still in sight, but they were closing in fast. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. It was time to bring this to an end. The roar of the engines echoed off the tall, rusting buildings as Jack and his crew pushed deeper into the industrial district. The silver SUV was just ahead, swerving dangerously as it tried to lose the bikers in the maze of darkened streets. Jack's eyes were locked on the tail lights of the vehicle. His grip on the handlebars tightened, and he felt his pulse quicken. They were close, so close he could almost reach out and touch it. "We've got them," Jack muttered to himself. The rest of the crew was in perfect formation behind him, their headlights cutting through the shadows like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. They were determined, no hesitation in their movements. This was no longer just a chase. It was personal. As they approached a tight corner, Jack's phone buzzed again. It was Wrench. "The road's gonna dead end up ahead," the message read. "Get ready for a final showdown." Jack felt the anger bubbling up inside him. They had come too far to let these guys get away now. The silver SUV took the next turn sharply, its tires squealing on the wet pavement. Jack cursed under his breath. "They're trying to make a break for it," he said to his crew over the radio. "Stay on them. We don't stop until we have them." They rounded another corner, and the SUV was still just in sight. The road was getting narrower, and the buildings loomed taller, casting long shadows that seemed to close in around them. It felt like the world was shrinking, and all that mattered was the SUV in front of them and the terrified girl they had to save. Jack could hear the faint hum of the radio in his ear. "We've got this," Diesel's voice crackled, full of confidence. "Let's finish it." The convoy of bikers surged forward, their engines roaring louder as they pressed on. The sound echoed in the narrow streets, making it feel like they were trapped inside a tunnel of noise and tension. As they neared the end of the street, Jack saw a large abandoned warehouse up ahead. The SUV had stopped in front of it, and two men jumped out, their movements quick and deliberate. Jack didn't hesitate. "All units, get ready. We're not playing around anymore," he ordered. He cut the engine to his bike, the sudden silence almost deafening. His crew followed suit, parking in a formation that blocked any possible escape. The men from the SUV were making their way toward the warehouse, but when they saw the bikers, their expressions changed. The swagger they had before was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. Jack's crew stood tall, their bodies towering in their leather jackets, their helmets gleaming under the dim light. They looked like a wall of steel and muscle, and the men who had taken the girl were realizing just how out of their depth they were. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This ends now. You took a kid. That's something we don't let slide." One of the men, a tall, thin figure, tried to act tough, but the shakiness in his voice gave him away. "You don't know who we are," he spat, trying to sound confident. "We're not afraid of a few bikers." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand. You've got two options. You can walk away, or you can stay and face the consequences." The tension in the air was thick, but the men seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to do next. Jack didn't wait for them to make up their minds. "Where's the girl?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The man looked around nervously, and that was all Jack needed. He moved forward quickly, reaching for the door of the warehouse. The two men tried to stop him, but before they could, the rest of the bikers were on them, blocking the doorway, their presence intimidating and unyielding. Jack pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as it revealed the inside of the warehouse. It was dark, the only light coming from the small cracks in the walls where moonlight filtered through. In the far corner, tied to a chair, was a young girl, the girl they had been chasing. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't cry out. She had been through too much to do that. Jack's heart clenched as he saw her. He moved quickly to untie the ropes that bound her. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "We've got you." She looked up at him, her face pale and tired, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Jack stood up, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You're with us now. No one's going to hurt you." The rest of the crew had gathered around, making sure the men from the SUV were secured and under control. The bikers stood watch, their eyes scanning the dark corners of the warehouse, making sure no one else was hiding. The girl, still shaken but no longer in immediate danger, stood slowly, her legs weak from the ordeal. Jack turned to the others. "Get her out of here," he said. "We're not leaving until we know she's safe." The convoy began to move out, the girl now safely riding with one of the bikers, her small form tucked protectively behind him. The road ahead seemed quieter, calmer now, but Jack knew the battle wasn't over. They had a long way to go before this story had its final chapter. The convoy of bikers made their way down the dark highway, the engines humming low as they continued their journey back. The night had grown colder, and the headlights of their bikes sliced through the emptiness. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the thundering of the engines echoing in the distance. Jack, at the front of the pack, kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept thinking about the girl they had just rescued, her pale face haunted by fear. He could still feel the weight of her small body in his arms as he untied the ropes that had bound her. She was free now, but Jack knew her battle wasn't over. None of them were. The girl's name was Maya. Jack hadn't heard of her until tonight, but he knew her father, Tyrone. Tyrone had saved Jack's life in a war zone years ago. The memory of that day was still fresh in Jack's mind, a memory that shaped his every decision. Tyrone had asked him to look after his daughter, and Jack had promised. That promise had driven him and his crew to Nebraska tonight. As they cruised down the highway, the lights of the city started to appear. In the distance, they were close to their destination. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence in his head. It was a message from Wrench, the quiet but reliable member of the crew. I've got eyes on the stepfather. He's at the hospital waiting to take her. We need to move fast. Jack's heart tightened. The last thing he wanted was to let Maya's stepfather, a man who was also a cop, get his hands on her again. The man had been the one to bring her into the hospital, claiming that she had fallen down the stairs. But the marks on her body told a different story. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars. We're not stopping. We're going to make sure she's safe, he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. The convoy's pace quickened as they approached the hospital. Jack could see the glowing lights of the building in the distance, the unmistakable sign that they were almost there. The hospital was surrounded by a small parking lot, and the place was quieter now, almost deserted. As they pulled into the lot, Jack's mind raced. He could see the entrance of the hospital clearly, the automatic doors standing open, and the security guard stationed by the front desk. But his eyes were fixed on the car parked just outside, a silver sedan with tinted windows. It was the stepfather's car. Jack's pulse quickened. This is it, he said. Let's make sure she's safe. The bikers parked their bikes in a tight formation, their engines cutting off in unison. The sudden silence that followed was unsettling, but Jack had no time to dwell on it. His eyes were fixed on the door to the hospital. They needed to get inside and make sure Maya was protected, no matter the cost. As they walked toward the entrance, the tension in the air was palpable. The hospital was quiet, too quiet. The sound of their boots echoed through the empty hallway. Jack led the way, his steps firm and purposeful. He had no intention of letting Maya's stepfather take her away again. Not after what he had done. When they reached the reception desk, Jack took a deep breath. The nurse behind the counter glanced up at him, her expression changing when she saw the group of bikers standing in front of her. Can I help you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack leaned over the counter, his voice calm but firm. We're here to see Maya Jenkins. Elena Vargas should be expecting us. The nurse looked at her computer screen, typing in the information. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the name. Maya Jenkins, she muttered under her breath, then nodded. She's on the 4th floor, room 412. Thank you, Jack said, turning toward the rest of the crew. Let's move. The group made their way to the elevator, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. They had come this far, and they weren't backing down. As the elevator doors closed behind them, the hum of the machine was the only sound. They arrived on the 4th floor and made their way down the hallway. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the anticipation growing with every step. When they reached room 412, Jack took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, Maya was sitting on the bed, looking pale and shaken, but she was no longer crying. Her eyes lifted as she saw Jack and the others walk in. She looked at them with a mixture of fear and hope. You came, she whispered. Jack smiled softly and walked toward her. You're safe now, he said, his voice gentle but filled with strength. No one's going to hurt you again. Maya's eyes welled up with tears, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of relief. The door behind them slammed shut suddenly, causing everyone to freeze. A chill ran down Jack's spine. He knew that sound. The sound of a door locking. The stepfather had found them. Jack's jaw clenched, his instincts taking over. Stay behind me, he ordered, his eyes never leaving the door. The rest of the bikers positioned themselves around the room, ready for whatever was coming. Jack's heart raced, but he knew this was the moment. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to let anything, or anyone, take Maya from them now. The door slammed shut behind them, locking with an audible click that made the air in the room grow heavy with tension. Jack's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained stone cold, his eyes locked on the door. He had known the moment they walked into the hospital that the stepfather would try something, but he hadn't expected it to happen this fast. His mind was racing, analyzing the situation, calculating every possible move. Maya was still sitting on the bed, her wide eyes locked on him, the fear evident in her expression. It's okay, Jack said, his voice low but firm. Stay behind me. Whatever happens, don't move. The other bikers positioned themselves around the room, each one a silent guardian, their bodies tense but ready. The room felt smaller with every passing second, the walls closing in as the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Jack knew the stepfather was just on the other side of that door, ready to barge in and claim Maya. He wasn't going to let that happen. He couldn't. "Jack, we've got this." Diesel's voice came through the intercom, steady and confident. Diesel was always the calm one in these situations, a rock when the storm hit. "We'll back you up." Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving the door. "Just stay ready," he replied. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, the silence thick with anticipation. Then, without warning, the door rattled, the handle jiggling as the stepfather tried to force his way inside. "Maya," came the voice from the other side, sharp and desperate. "Open this door right now." Maya's face twisted with a mix of fear and anger, but she didn't move, not even a muscle. Jack could see it in her eyes. She was terrified, but she wasn't going to let him control her anymore. Jack moved forward slowly, his boots clicking against the floor as he approached the door. "You need to step back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is over." He didn't need to say anything more. The bikers were already moving into position, blocking the door, making sure that no one could get through. The sound of the door handle rattling again filled the room, but Jack was ready. "This is your last chance," Jack called out, his voice calm but unwavering. "If you don't leave now, you'll regret it." Silence. The seconds dragged on, the tension building like a pressure cooker about to explode. And then, suddenly, the sound of retreating footsteps echoed down the hallway. The stepfather had given up, for now. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "It's not over," he muttered to himself. "But we've bought some time." Maya looked up at him, her eyes still wide but filled with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack gave her a small smile, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you again." He looked at the rest of the crew. "Let's get out of here. We need to get her somewhere safe." The bikers nodded in unison, their movements synchronized as they prepared to leave. As Jack turned to lead the way, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The stepfather may have backed down for now, but Jack knew he wouldn't give up easily. This wasn't just about Maya. It was about something bigger, something Jack didn't fully understand yet. But whatever it was, Jack was determined to protect her, and to make sure no one else ever had to live in fear again. As they made their way out of the hospital, the sound of their boots echoed in the empty hallway. They moved quickly, efficiently, like a well-oiled machine. Jack's mind was racing, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. Maya was safe, for now. That was all that mattered. But Jack knew that things weren't over yet. Not by a long shot. As they reached the parking lot, the convoy of bikes roared to life, the engines vibrating in the air as they prepared to ride out. Jack glanced back at Maya, who was now sitting in the back of one of the bikes, her body trembling but her eyes filled with a sense of relief. They were going to take her somewhere safe, somewhere she could heal. But Jack knew that no matter how far they went, no matter how many miles they put between themselves and the danger, the threat would always be there. The road ahead was long, and the shadows of their pasts would always be waiting for them. But for now, Jack pushed those thoughts aside. He had made a promise to his friend, and he was going to keep it. "Let's ride," he said to his crew, his voice steady and firm. The engines roared as the convoy sped off, the headlights cutting through the night as they disappeared into the darkness. Jack's mind was still on the road ahead, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his crew. They had fought for something bigger than themselves, something that mattered more than anything else. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like they were all part of something that was worth fighting for. The convoy of bikers rode through the dark, their engines cutting through the silence of the night like a chorus of thunder. Jack led the way, his mind focused, his grip firm on the handlebars. They had made it out of the hospital, but the threat wasn't over. The stepfather was still out there, and Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down. Maya was safe for now, but the question that kept running through his mind was whether they would be able to keep her safe in the long run. The convoy kept moving, the road stretching out ahead of them, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the dark highway behind them, but he saw nothing, just the flickering of headlights from the other bikes. "We've got to get to the hideout," Jack said to Diesel, who was riding next to him. Diesel gave a quick nod. Yeah, I know. We'll be safe there. The thought of a safe house, a place where they could regroup and lay low, was a welcome one. But Jack knew that nothing was truly safe. Not anymore. They rode for miles, the cool air rushing past them, but even the sound of their bikes wasn't enough to drown out the tension that hung in the air. The closer they got to the hideout, the more Jack could feel the weight of the promise he had made to his friend Tyrone. The promise to protect his family. He had kept his word tonight, but the battle was far from over. The convoy took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, the dust kicking up behind them as they made their way into the woods. The hideout was nestled deep in the forest, hidden away from prying eyes. It had been the perfect place to lay low when things got too hot. Jack slowed his bike as they approached the clearing, the sound of the engines fading into the quiet of the woods. They pulled into the small clearing, the headlights cutting through the trees, illuminating the old cabin that stood at the center. It was worn and weathered, but it was home. For now, it would have to do. Jack turned off his bike and stepped off, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the cabin. Diesel, Wrench, and the others followed, their faces hard with determination. They had been through a lot together, but this felt different. This was a fight they hadn't expected. They had made it this far, but they weren't sure how much longer they could hold on. Jack opened the door to the cabin and stepped inside, the familiar smell of wood and earth greeting him. The room was small, but it was enough for what they needed. Maya was sitting on the old couch, her small frame curled up in a blanket. She had been quiet since they left the hospital, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Jack walked over to her, his heart aching at the sight of her. You're safe here, he said gently, sitting down beside her. No one is going to hurt you. I promise. Maya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Are they going to come after us again? She asked, her voice small and trembling. Jack's heart tightened. He didn't want to lie to her. I don't know, he said truthfully. But we'll fight, Maya. We won't let anyone hurt you. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a small sense of comfort. Diesel walked in and sat down on the opposite side of the room, his eyes scanning the cabin, ever vigilant. We need to make sure the perimeter is secure, he said quietly. Jack nodded. He knew Diesel was right. They couldn't afford to be careless. The situation had already become more dangerous than they had expected. They had to stay alert, stay ready. Wrench, you and Shadow take the back. Make sure the place is sealed up tight, Jack ordered. Wrench and Shadow nodded and headed toward the back of the cabin. Jack turned back to Maya, his face softening as he looked at her. You've been through a lot. I'm sorry you had to see all of that. But you're safe now. Maya nodded, though her face remained tense. She had seen more than any child should have to. But she had also witnessed something else, the strength of the people who had come to her aid. Jack could see the small glimmer of trust in her eyes, but he knew that it would take time to heal the wounds that had been caused. He sat with her for a while, just talking in a low voice, reassuring her that they were safe. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer for now. Outside, the rest of the crew was securing the area, making sure there were no surprises waiting for them. Jack knew they had to stay one step ahead, but he also knew they couldn't keep running forever. The stepfather wouldn't give up, and there were people out there who would stop at nothing to get Maya back. Jack leaned back on the couch, letting out a long sigh. He had kept his promise tonight, but the road ahead was far from certain. And with each passing hour, the danger was only growing. He couldn't protect Maya forever, but he was damn sure going to try. As the night stretched on, the bikers settled in, the cabin quiet except for the occasional sound of footsteps or the crackling of the fire in the corner. Jack's eyes stayed on Maya, watching her as she tried to sleep, her small body curled into the blanket. He knew this wasn't over, but for now, he could give her this peace. And that would have to be enough. The cabin was quiet, but the tension in the air was thick. Jack sat across from Maya, watching as she tried to sleep, her small body wrapped tightly in the blanket. The flickering light from the fire cast long shadows on the walls, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. His mind kept racing, trying to predict what would happen next, but he knew that nothing was ever certain. Diesel stood by the window, his eyes scanning the dark woods outside. The sound of wind rustling through the trees was the only thing breaking the silence. Jack could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone settling heavily on his shoulders. The job wasn't done yet. Maya was safe for now, but she had a long way to go before she could feel truly safe. And Jack knew that her stepfather wouldn't give up so easily. He had a few hours to rest, but sleep was hard to come by with his mind on high alert. Jack rubbed his hand over his face, trying to shake the exhaustion. "How long do you think we can keep her here?" Diesel asked quietly, his voice low enough not to disturb Maya. Jack looked up, meeting Diesel's eyes. "Not long," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't stay in one place for too long. The moment he knows where we are, we're out of options." Diesel nodded, his expression hard. "We need a plan, Jack. A real one. We can't keep running forever." Jack stood up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles. "I know," he muttered. "But for now, we keep her safe. That's all we can do." The door creaked open, and Wrench stepped inside, his face serious. "I just got off the phone with Hawk," Wrench said, his voice low. "The word's out. The stepfather's making some calls. He's not alone anymore. There's someone else after her." Jack's heart sank. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight. Wrench shook his head. "Don't know yet. But they're coming. Fast." Jack's eyes narrowed. He had hoped that by getting Maya to the hideout, they would have a few days of peace. But it was clear now that they didn't have that luxury. The bikers had always been one step ahead, but that might not be enough this time. He turned to Diesel, his mind already working through the possibilities. "We need to get moving. Now," Jack said, his voice urgent. "Wrench, get the bikes ready. Diesel, go check the perimeter again. Make sure we're not being followed." The crew moved quickly, their faces set with determination. They were used to danger, but this was different. This was about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. Jack didn't know what was waiting for them out there, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't afford to fail. As the bikers prepped their bikes, Jack stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him like a wall. The sound of engines starting echoed in the distance, and the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he couldn't let it show. Not now. Not with Maya depending on him. He turned back to the cabin, watching as Maya stood by the door, her face pale, but her eyes determined. She had been through so much already, but she wasn't breaking. "We need to go, Maya," Jack said softly, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, her small hand gripping the doorframe. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We're going to keep you safe," he said. "But we need to move quickly." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if they find us again?" she asked. Jack's heart clenched, but he pushed the feeling aside. "We won't let that happen," he promised. He could feel her fear, but he also saw the strength in her, the same strength that had gotten her this far. It was that strength that would carry her through whatever came next. The convoy was ready, the bikes lined up and engines revving. Jack gave a nod to Diesel, who led the way, and the group rode off into the night, the sound of their bikes filling the silence once more. The road ahead was dark, the headlights cutting through the night, but Jack's focus was sharp. They couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep Maya safe. The weight of the promise hung heavy in his mind, but he knew it was a promise he would keep. He had to. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Jack would protect Maya at all costs. He had no choice. The road ahead was filled with danger, but Jack and his crew were ready to face whatever came their way. They had no other option but to keep moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than the fear. They weren't just a group of bikers anymore. They were a family, and nothing would tear them apart. The convoy of bikes continued down the dark highway, their engines growling low, vibrating through the cold night air. Jack kept his eyes forward, his mind sharp, scanning the road ahead. The last few hours had been a blur of action, but now, with Maya safely riding behind one of the bikers, the tension had only shifted. It was far from over. As the convoy moved, Jack could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Maya's stepfather was out there, and Jack knew he wouldn't rest until he got what he wanted. The question wasn't if he would come for her, but when. "We need to find somewhere to regroup," Jack said, his voice calm but firm, his focus never wavering. Diesel nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "I agree. The longer we stay on the move, the more likely we are to be tracked." Jack's mind was already working through their options. The hideout they had been using wasn't safe anymore. They couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. They needed somewhere more secure. somewhere no one would expect them to be. The convoy made a sharp turn off the main road, taking a smaller, less traveled path into the woods. The headlights cut through the thick forest, illuminating the narrow trail ahead. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, and the air felt heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. They had entered familiar territory. The hidden cabin was only a few miles away, but Jack knew better than to relax. "We're almost there," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Stay alert." The crew rode in silence, the only sound the thrum of their engines and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As they reached the cabin, the familiar sight of the small, weathered building in the distance gave Jack a small sense of relief. This was their base of operations, their safe place. But as they pulled up, Jack's instincts were on high alert. Something wasn't right. The silence felt wrong. There was no sign of the usual wildlife. No birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just an unsettling stillness. Jack pulled his bike to a stop in front of the cabin, his eyes scanning the area. The other bikers parked behind him, their faces hard with determination, ready for anything. "Wrench, Shadow, check the perimeter," Jack ordered. The two bikers nodded and moved swiftly, their movements practiced and quiet. Jack turned to Diesel. "Stay with Maya. Keep her inside." Diesel gave a quick nod before heading toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the area around him. Jack's heart beat faster. They couldn't afford any surprises. They had come too far to let something go wrong now. He waited for Wrench and Shadow to return, his mind running through scenarios. What if the stepfather had already found them? What if they had been followed? The minutes felt like hours. Finally, Wrench and Shadow reappeared from the woods, their faces grim. "We've got company," Wrench said quietly. "Not far off. A couple of cars, maybe more." Jack's stomach tightened. "How many?" he asked, his voice low. "At least 4, Shadow replied, his expression hard. "They're closing in." Jack's thoughts raced. "We don't have much time." He turned to his crew. "Get ready. We hold our ground here. We don't run." The bikers readied themselves, their expressions steely. This wasn't their first time being cornered. They knew how to fight, how to protect their own. "Maya's inside, right?" Jack asked, his eyes locking with Diesel's. Diesel nodded. "She's safe." Jack's gaze hardened. "We make sure she stays that way." The convoy of bikers stood together, ready for what was coming. The sound of engines grew louder in the distance, growing closer with every passing second. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his bike, his face set in a determined expression. The others fell into formation around him, their bodies forming a protective circle. They had been through too much to back down now. "We're not running," Jack said, his voice steady. "We protect our own. We've got a job to do." The sound of approaching cars filled the air as the headlights began to cut through the trees. Jack could see them now. 3 cars, their headlights flashing through the darkness. They were coming straight for the cabin. Jack's grip tightened on his bike, and he could feel the adrenaline begin to surge through his veins. The stepfather and his men were getting closer. Jack's mind went into overdrive, analyzing every move, every possibility. "Stay close," Jack said to the crew. "We make our stand here. No one gets past us." The cars finally came into view, their headlights shining like searching spotlights in the woods. Jack's heart raced, but his resolve didn't waver. The bikers stood their ground, their posture solid, their hands ready. As the cars slowed and came to a stop, the sound of engines idling in the quiet forest was deafening. The tension was thick. The door to the lead car opened, and a man stepped out. Jack recognized him immediately. It was one of the stepfather's associates. "This is it," Jack muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. The man stepped toward them, his hands in the air, trying to appear calm. But Jack could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his waistband. Jack's crew tightened their formation, ready for whatever was coming. "I don't want any trouble," the man said, his voice steady, but Jack could tell he was nervous. Jack didn't move, his eyes locked on the man. "You've got one chance," Jack said. "Leave now, and we won't have to deal with you." The man laughed, but it was hollow. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. Jack's response was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who had nothing to lose. "You're outnumbered, and you're on our turf." The man's smile faded, and he stepped back, his hand inching toward his waist. But Jack was faster. "Make your move," Jack said, his voice low, steady. The standoff had begun. The man's hand moved slowly toward his waistband, and the tension in the air thickened. Jack's crew stood firm, their eyes never leaving their target. The sound of the forest around them seemed to fade, leaving only the heavy, rhythmic pulse of their hearts. Jack's grip on his bike tightened, his body coiled and ready to move. The man stopped his movement, sensing the weight of the situation. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he sneered, his voice trying to mask the unease he was feeling. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You've already crossed the line," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "You're not going anywhere." The man, still standing in the middle of the clearing, looked back at the cars behind him, where two other figures had now exited, guns in hand. They hadn't planned on a standoff, but they weren't backing down now. The air was thick with the potential for violence, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Jack's team stayed still, their bodies locked into place. They had been through worse. They were trained for this. The leader of the group, the man who had stepped out first, took a deep breath and made his move. His hand darted to his waist, and in one fluid motion, he pulled out a gun. But he wasn't fast enough. In the blink of an eye, Diesel was moving, his body sliding behind the cover of the nearby tree, his own gun drawn in an instant. The standoff erupted into chaos. The sound of tires screeching filled the night air as one of the men in the cars tried to make a run for it, attempting to back up into the woods. Jack saw it happening in slow motion and acted immediately. "Don't let him get away," he yelled, his voice low but commanding. Diesel, fast on his feet, dove toward the car, blocking the path of the man attempting to escape. There was a crackle of gunfire as one of the men fired a warning shot, but Diesel was already on top of him, slamming his shoulder into the man's chest and knocking him to the ground. The other bikers sprang into action, moving in sync with the precision of a well-practiced unit. Wrench and Shadow, quick as ever, took cover behind the cabin, their guns aimed at the remaining targets. Jack moved forward, his own gun drawn now, keeping his aim steady on the man still standing, his gun trained on the bikers. "Move and I shoot," Jack said, his voice calm, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. The man hesitated, his hands shaking slightly as he looked at the weapon Jack held. The bikers closed in from all sides, their presence overwhelming. The standoff seemed to stretch on forever, the forest eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the crackle of a gunshot in the distance. Finally, the man's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his gun. "I'm not going to fight," he muttered, his voice trembling. "You win. Just don't kill me." Jack's eyes never left him. "You're lucky we're giving you a choice," Jack said, his voice low and unwavering. "You should have thought of that before you took her." The man stepped back slowly, his hands still raised in surrender. Behind him, the other two men were restrained by Wrench and Shadow, who were now making sure the area was secure. Jack nodded to Diesel, who held the man who had tried to run. "Take them to the cabin. We'll deal with them later," Jack ordered, his voice authoritative. Diesel didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the man roughly by the arm, pulling him toward the cabin. As they passed Jack, the man shot him a pleading look, but Jack didn't flinch. He knew what had to be done. He couldn't let anyone jeopardize the safety of his crew, or of Maya. The rest of the bikers moved to secure the perimeter, their eyes scanning the trees, ensuring there were no more surprises lurking in the shadows. Jack turned and walked toward the cabin, his mind already working through the next steps. Maya was safe for now, but they weren't out of danger yet. The stepfather's allies weren't going to give up easily. They had a target on their backs, and Jack was going to make sure they stayed one step ahead. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. As he walked into the cabin, Jack found Diesel sitting by the door, his expression grim. "We've got them," Diesel said. "But it won't be long before they come looking for their guys." Jack nodded. "I know. We don't have much time. We move out tomorrow. Find a place where they won't expect us." He paused, looking over at Maya, who was sitting on the couch, her small frame curled up under a blanket. She was quiet, too quiet. The trauma was weighing heavily on her, but Jack knew the worst of it wasn't over. "We'll get you somewhere safe, Maya," Jack said softly, walking over to her. She looked up at him, her eyes still wide with fear, but there was something else there now too. Hope. "We won't let anyone hurt you again." Jack's voice was calm, reassuring, as he knelt beside her. "You're with us now, and we protect our own." Maya nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Jack sat beside her for a moment, letting the quiet settle between them. The situation was dire, but he wouldn't let that stop him. Not now. Not when they were this close. They would get through this together. Jack stood up, his resolve hardening. "We ride out at first light," he said, his voice steady. The bikers around him nodded in agreement. Jack turned to Diesel. "Make sure everyone's ready. No mistakes." Diesel stood up and gave a quick salute, his expression unreadable. "Got it." Jack turned back to Maya, offering her a reassuring smile before heading toward the door. The night was far from over, and the battle was just beginning. The first rays of dawn broke through the dense trees, casting an eerie light over the clearing where Jack and his crew had spent the night. The cold night air was giving way to the chill of morning, but Jack's mind was still sharp, his thoughts racing. They had made it through the night without incident, but the worst wasn't over. The stepfather and his men were still out there, and Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they had Maya. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and glanced around the cabin. The crew was already stirring, gathering their gear and preparing for the ride ahead. Diesel and Wrench were going over the plans for the day, making sure everything was in place. Jack walked over to Maya, who was sitting by the window, her small figure still wrapped in the blanket. She had been quieter than usual this morning, her face pale and her eyes distant. Jack could see the toll this was taking on her. She had been through so much already, and the road ahead was still uncertain. "Maya," Jack said gently, kneeling down beside her. "We're going to get you somewhere safe. Just hold on a little longer, all right?" Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. "How long do we have?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's heart clenched. He didn't have an answer. He knew the stepfather was close, and he didn't know how long they could keep running. But he wasn't going to let Maya down. "Not now." "We'll make it," Jack said, his voice steady. "You're with us now. We'll keep you safe." He offered her a small smile, though he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The truth was, Jack didn't know how much longer they could stay ahead of their enemies. The bikers had always been a tight-knit group, but the stakes had never been higher. As they gathered outside, Jack looked over at his crew, his brothers in arms. They had been through hell together, but this time felt different. This was about more than just the ride. It was about protecting Maya, keeping the promise he had made to his friend Tyrone. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. The convoy roared to life as the bikers revved their engines, the sound cutting through the still morning air. Jack took his place at the front of the pack, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Diesel was behind him, followed by Wrench, and the rest of the crew filled in behind them. They were ready. As they hit the open road, the trees thinned, and the landscape opened up before them. Jack's mind was focused, his thoughts on the mission at hand. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. They couldn't afford to get caught. Every mile felt like it brought them closer to safety, but Jack knew better than to relax. They still had to keep moving, stay ahead of their pursuers. The road stretched on ahead of them, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to focus on the wind rushing past him, the feeling of freedom that came with the open road. But it didn't last. His thoughts were quickly interrupted by the sound of a radio crackling in his ear. It was Wrench. "We've got a problem," Wrench's voice came through. "Two cars tailing us. They're not far behind." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "How far?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Not far," Wrench replied. "We've got to make a move, or they'll catch us." Jack's mind raced. "Head toward the back roads," he ordered. "We'll take the long way. Stay off the main routes." He gave a quick signal to Diesel, and the convoy made a sharp turn, veering off the main highway and onto a dirt road that wound through the trees. The sound of their engines echoed through the forest, the bikes kicking up dust as they sped along. The trees closed in on both sides, and Jack's eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of the cars that were tailing them. They couldn't afford to be caught. Jack knew they had to keep moving. If they slowed down for even a second, it could be the end. The road ahead was rough, filled with sharp turns and uneven terrain, but Jack had been on worse. He had faced danger before, but this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line. As they navigated the twists and turns of the dirt road, Jack's thoughts returned to Maya. He could feel the weight of her presence behind him, her small body gripping the bike tightly, trusting him to keep her safe. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. The convoy pushed on, the sound of their engines reverberating through the trees, but the cars were still following, getting closer with every turn. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars as he pushed the bike harder, urging the crew to keep pace. They couldn't afford to let the cars get any closer. A sharp turn came up ahead, and Jack leaned into it, his body following the curve of the road. The convoy followed suit, but as they came out of the turn, Jack saw something that made his heart stop. One of the cars was blocking the road ahead, its headlights glaring in the dim morning light. They were trapped. Jack swore under his breath, his mind already calculating their next move. The convoy had nowhere to go. The car in front was too close, and the others were still behind them. Jack's eyes flicked to Diesel, who was already making his way to the front of the pack. "Get ready," Jack said, his voice low. "This is it." The bikers slowed, readying themselves for whatever came next. The car blocking their path slowly rolled forward, the engine humming as it came closer. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The showdown was coming, and he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The car blocking the road ahead slowly moved forward, its headlights glaring in the dim morning light, casting long shadows across the dirt path. Jack's heart raced as he quickly assessed their situation. The convoy was surrounded, and the way forward was blocked. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The man in the car wasn't backing down, and neither were Jack and his crew. Jack glanced in the rearview mirror. The other car was closing in from behind, but he couldn't afford to worry about that now. The front was their main problem. The convoy had come to a halt, the sound of their engines rumbling softly in the still air, the bikes lined up, ready for whatever came next. Jack's mind was racing, but he kept his cool, knowing that a moment's hesitation could cost them everything. "Get ready," he said, his voice steady. "They're not going to make this easy." Diesel, who had been riding next to Jack, gave a quick nod, his face grim. The rest of the crew was already preparing, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense, waiting for the moment to strike. The car in front was now just a few feet away, its engine humming as the driver slowly inched closer. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. Jack's fingers tightened around the handlebar of his bike, his mind already calculating what they needed to do next. His thoughts were interrupted as the man in the car rolled down his window, his voice loud and clear. "You think you can stop us?" he yelled, trying to sound tough, but there was a hint of uncertainty beneath his words. Jack didn't flinch. "Move your car. Now," he said, his voice low and firm. He wasn't about to give in to threats or intimidation. The man in the car hesitated for a moment, and Jack saw his chance. "Last warning," Jack growled, his voice filled with authority. The biker crew behind him tensed, preparing for action. The man in the car clearly saw that Jack meant business, and after a long pause, he slammed the car into reverse. The car screeched backward, but Jack was already moving. He signaled to his crew, and in an instant, they were on the move. The convoy surged forward, their engines roaring to life as they pushed toward the open space. But the car behind them wasn't backing down either. Jack's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The second car was closing in fast. "They're not letting up," Wrench called out over the radio. "We need to make a move before they pin us in." Jack's mind raced, but he didn't show any sign of panic. "Stay on course," he ordered. "We keep moving, no matter what." The convoy's engines roared in unison as they sped down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind them. The sound of their bikes drowned out everything else, but Jack's focus never wavered. The first car was now behind them, tailing them closely, but Jack knew they couldn't outrun them for long. They needed a plan. "We can't keep running like this," Jack muttered to himself. His mind was calculating their options. There was a river up ahead. If they could make it there, they might be able to lose them in the dense forest. "Diesel, take the lead," Jack said into the radio. "We're going for the river. Everyone follow closely." Diesel's voice came back almost immediately. "Got it. We'll make it." The convoy accelerated, their bikes tearing through the dirt as they headed for the river. The second car was still in pursuit, but Jack was confident in his crew's ability to handle the situation. The first car was still behind them, but the convoy's speed was starting to put some distance between them. They could make it to the river, lose the cars, and regroup. Jack's heart pounded as they neared the riverbank. The trees were thick on either side, and the ground was muddy from the recent rain. The path was narrow, but the bikes were powerful, cutting through the terrain with ease. Jack's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror once more. The second car was still on their tail, but the first car was beginning to fall behind. "We're almost there," Jack muttered, his fingers tightening on the handlebars. Just as they reached the river, the second car came into view behind them, the headlights flashing like a warning. Jack didn't slow down. He could see the narrow bridge ahead, and if they could make it across, they'd be home free. "We cross the bridge and keep going," Jack said, his voice steady. Diesel was already ahead, leading the pack, while Jack and the rest of the crew followed closely behind. The convoy reached the bridge, the sound of their engines filling the air as they roared across the wooden structure. But just as they reached the other side, the screech of tires pierced the air, and the second car slammed into the side of the bridge. Jack's heart raced. They had almost made it. The crew quickly shifted gears, making a sharp turn into the forest as the car skidded to a halt behind them. Jack's eyes were sharp as he glanced over his shoulder. The car wasn't following. The bikers had successfully evaded them, for now. "We're good," Jack said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "But we can't stay here long." The crew stopped for a moment to catch their breath, their eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The second car had been left behind on the other side of the bridge, but they knew they wouldn't be safe for long. Jack knew this wasn't over. It was just a matter of time before they'd have to face the stepfather again. And when that time came, Jack was ready to finish what he started. The air was thick with tension as the bikers stood in the dense woods, their engines now silent. Jack's eyes scanned the forest around them, the shadows cast by the trees hiding any potential threats. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his mind still running on high alert. They had evaded the cars, but for how long? The stepfather and his men weren't going to give up so easily. Jack turned to Diesel, who had been keeping watch over the group. "We need to move again," Jack said, his voice steady. "We can't stay here. They'll find us if we do." Diesel nodded, his face grim. "I know. We're not out of the woods yet." The others were gathered in a tight circle, their eyes trained on Jack as they listened to the plan. "We head to the next town," Jack continued, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "We get there, we lay low for a while, and we figure out our next move." The crew nodded in agreement, understanding the urgency in Jack's voice. They had been through worse, but this was different. They were protecting someone who didn't have the strength to fight back, someone who had already been through more than any child should. The thought of what she had endured, of the fear in her eyes, pushed Jack to move forward. He couldn't stop now. They couldn't stop. "Maya," Jack said, turning to her. She was still quiet, sitting at the edge of the group, her eyes distant. Jack knew she was scared, that she didn't fully understand what was happening, but he also knew she trusted them, and they weren't about to let her down. "We're going to get you to a safe place," Jack said softly. "I promise. But we need you to stay with us. Don't go anywhere alone, okay?" Maya nodded slowly, though her expression didn't change. She had been through too much to smile, too much to feel safe, but Jack could see a flicker of hope in her eyes. She wasn't giving up, and neither were they. The convoy started their engines, the sound of the bikes filling the air again. Jack was at the front, as always, with Diesel riding close behind. Wrench, Shadow, and the others formed a protective circle around the group, keeping their eyes on the road ahead. They had no idea what was waiting for them, but they couldn't afford to show any weakness. As they rode through the winding roads, Jack kept his thoughts focused. His mind kept drifting back to the promise he had made to Tyrone. He had sworn to protect Maya, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. The bikes roared through the countryside, the wind whipping past them as the forest slowly gave way to open fields. They were getting closer to the town, closer to safety. Jack didn't know how much time they had, but he was determined to make sure Maya was safe. The sound of approaching cars shattered his thoughts. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and his heart skipped a beat. The same two cars were tailing them again, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack cursed under his breath. "They're still following us," he said, his voice low. "We need to lose them." The crew moved quickly, their bodies tense as they prepared for whatever was coming next. Jack sped up, the bikes tearing down the road as they tried to shake off their pursuers. The cars were getting closer, their headlights brighter, the sound of their engines growing louder with every passing second. Jack's mind raced. He needed to think of something, anything, to get them out of this situation. The road ahead was narrow, the trees lining the sides, but Jack saw a turn up ahead, a dirt road that cut through the forest. It was their only chance. "Take the next turn," Jack shouted over the roar of the engines. Everyone, follow me. He swerved sharply, pushing his bike into the dirt road, the tires kicking up gravel behind him. The others followed closely behind, the convoy moving as one, their bikes tearing through the rough terrain. The cars were still behind them, but Jack could feel the distance between them growing. The dirt road twisted through the woods, narrow and winding, but the bikes were built for this. The cars, on the other hand, weren't. Jack glanced over his shoulder, seeing the first car trying to keep up, but it was struggling. The second car had fallen behind, its headlights barely visible in the distance. Jack's pulse quickened as they reached a clearing. The road ahead opened up, leading to a large, abandoned barn. Jack's eyes scanned the area. This could be their moment. Head toward the barn, Jack ordered. We'll make our stand there. The convoy sped toward the barn, the bikes roaring across the open field. They reached the barn just as the cars came into view again, but the bikers had already dismounted, their positions set. Jack was the first to get off his bike, his gun ready in his hand. Diesel, Wrench, and the rest of the crew spread out, taking defensive positions. The two cars came to a screeching halt just outside the barn, their doors slamming open as the men inside spilled out. Jack could see the fear in their eyes, but there was no backing down now. The bikers were ready. They had come this far, and they weren't going to let anyone hurt Maya. Jack stood tall, his voice steady as he faced the men. This ends now, he said. You're not getting past us. The tension in the air was thick as the men slowly raised their weapons, but Jack and his crew didn't flinch. They were ready, and this time, they were going to make sure Maya stayed safe, no matter what it took. The air was thick with tension, the sound of the bikes roaring in the background as the standoff reached its peak. Jack stood tall, his eyes locked on the men who had been tailing them for miles. The moment had arrived. The crew was in position, ready to defend, but there was a certain quiet confidence in Jack's posture. He had been through countless battles, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about protecting someone who needed them. Maya was behind him, safe for now, but Jack knew that wouldn't last unless they ended this. This ends now, Jack said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. He wasn't backing down, not now. The men in front of him looked hesitant, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but none of them moved. The standoff dragged on, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jack didn't flinch, his eyes steady as he watched their every move. The man at the front, the one who had been leading the group, stepped forward, his hands raised. You don't know what you're dealing with, he said, his voice strained. You think you can just walk away from this? You've made a mistake. Jack's eyes narrowed, the threat hanging in the air between them. You're the one who's made the mistake, Jack replied, his voice calm but filled with authority. This is over. You're not taking her. The man's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering to his crew, but Jack saw the hesitation. They weren't ready for this fight, not like the bikers were. The standoff could have gone on for much longer, but just as the man took a step back, there was a flash of movement. One of the men behind Jack made a sudden move, trying to break through the line. It was a split-second decision, but Diesel was faster. He reacted immediately, grabbing the man and slamming him into the ground. The sound of a gunshot rang out, but it was a warning shot, not aimed at anyone. Jack's crew didn't hesitate. Wrench and Shadow were on the other men in seconds, their training kicking in as they disarmed and subdued the would-be attackers. The entire scene unfolded in what felt like an instant. Jack's heart raced as the dust settled. The attackers were on the ground, disarmed and under control. Jack walked toward the leader of the group, his eyes cold and unyielding. You've lost, Jack said, his voice unwavering. The man looked up at him, eyes filled with defiance, but also with the realization that there was no way out. Jack stepped closer, his gaze steady. You're not going to hurt anyone else, he said, his voice filled with finality. The man didn't respond, but Jack saw the defeat in his eyes. The bikers secured the area, making sure there were no more surprises. The fight was over, and they had won. Jack turned to his crew, his expression softening for the first time that night. Good work, everyone, he said, his voice low but filled with pride. The crew nodded, each of them moving to check the perimeter and make sure everything was secure. Maya, who had been standing at the edge of the group, stepped forward slowly. She looked at Jack, her eyes still filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, her voice small but sincere. Jack gave her a small smile, his heart heavy. "You're safe now," he said gently. "We're not going to let anyone hurt you again." The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace. They had done it. They had protected her. They had kept their promise. But Jack knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more battles, more dangers ahead, but for now, they had won. The convoy mounted their bikes again, ready to move out. The sun was beginning to rise, the sky lightening in the distance. It was a new day, and they were still standing. Jack looked around at his crew, the men and women who had become his family. They had fought for something greater than themselves, and they had come out on top. They were more than just bikers. They were a force, a family, and Jack would do whatever it took to keep them safe. As they roared down the road once more, the sound of the engines was a reminder that they weren't done yet. The journey was far from over, but for now, they had won. And that was enough.